OK, so Boris Johnson has urged Israel's allies to never waver in their support for Israel in the war against Hamas.
Well, his show of support comes at a time when there's increasing criticism and division amongst the public and politicians over Israel's continued bombing of Gaza.
The former Prime Minister toured some of the communities attacked by terrorists on the 7th of October. In an exclusive interview with our security editor Mark White, he said he was horrified by what he saw and called on the international community to remember those events.
I think it was very important to come here because it's now a month exactly since the appalling atrocities of October the 7th. And I wanted to see it for myself, see the evidence of what happened for myself. But I also worry that across the world, even in our country, the memory of that horror is fading. And people don't understand quite how appalling Hamas's crimes were. And we need to focus on that because we've got to stop this crazy moral equivalence between Hamas terrorism and what Israel is now trying to do to make sure it never happens again.
Well, I'm sure that Israel will certainly welcome your visit, given that, you were widely seen as leading the charge in terms of the international community and giving support to Ukraine. What do you say to Israel's allies to ensure that they stay the course, that they are full square behind Israel?
I think people just need to remember what happened on October the 7th. And I've seen, as I'm sure you have too, I've been into those rooms in that kibbutz Kfar Hazar, the obvious signs of innocent families mercilessly done to death, tortured. I mean, high caliber weapons fired at them from point blank range, blood, I'm afraid to say, all over the sofa of a family, all over the floor. You could see exactly what had happened. And I only went to one house, right? And there was street after street had been brutalized in the same way. Look at what happened. Remember, this was sadism. This was an orgy of brutality and torture against innocent people. People were chased around the rooms in their houses and shot. Now, there's a difference between that and what the Israeli soldiers are now trying to do in Gaza. So your point, Mark, about what the international community needs to remember is the difference between what Israel experienced, the terrorist attack, and what they're trying to do now. What they're trying to do now is make sure that never happens again. And what I'm saying is, yes, of course, we all want peace. We would all love to see an end to hostilities. But we've got to give Israel the time and the space to conduct the operation, to track down the people who did this, and to make sure they can never do it again.
The 7th of October does fade, and all the images now are of the suffering of the people. And of course there are lots of civilians caught up in this. The UN are saying that Israel might be guilty of war crimes. Are you concerned at all at the way in which Israel is prosecuting the war?
I think there's as far as I can see, and I'm sure as you have too, I've talked to members of the Israeli Defense Forces. I've seen what Israel is trying to do. It's in a morally different category. A morally different category from what Hamas did on October the 7th. That was absolutely vicious. It was sadistic. It was intended to harm, to torture, and to inculcate fear in the maximum possible number of civilians. The Israelis are trying to do the opposite. They're trying to find the people who did it, but with the minimum harm to civilians. Now that's very difficult given the urban environment of Gaza. And because Israel is, I believe, fundamentally a civilized, democratic society, they're going to take a long time to do it. Therefore, I say to people, we've got to be reasonable, and we've got to recognize that Israel is not going to be able to accomplish this overnight.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
see many, many thousands of people taking to the streets of London and other cities. I mean, do you think that, for instance, the continued refusal of the BBC to call a spade and call Hamas a terrorist group in some ways legitimises Hamas in the eyes of many people? They think actually they're freedom fighters.
I've got to tell you, look, I'm not going to come out to another country, supportive though I am of this country. I'm not going to come out and slag off great media organisations in our own country, right? That's not what I'm going to do. But what I will say is that the people who take those decisions about use of terrorist or not terrorist, they should go to the rooms that I've just been in. They should go to Kfar Afaz and the other places, and to all the sites where the brutality was dispensed by those Hamas terrorists. And they would be in absolutely no doubt what those people were trying to do. They were trying to terrify. They were using human terror as an instrument of war and of violence and of to achieve their political ends. That is not what the Israelis are trying to do. And so what I hope, and I hope not just they, but also the many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people around the world who are cutting Hamas so much slack should look at what happened. And they should realize that when they go on these marches and they shout these slogans, I think quite hate-filled slogans against Israel, they are actually giving their support to the kind of crazed, racist violence that we saw on October the 7th.
Well, we know, of course, that many thousands are due to head out next weekend during Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday. A lot of concern about what might happen and calls for that march to be prevented, to be banned. Do you actually agree with that these marches should not go ahead?
They should remember that Remembrance Sunday is there very largely to commemorate the many people in our country, but also across the Commonwealth, who fought against Nazism and fascism. And I think for them to go out and demonstrate in favour of an anti-Semitic pogrom, which is what they would be doing, is obscene.
So should the marches be cancelled?
I think that's a matter for the police and how they manage it.
On the issue of where we go further down the road, I know Israel's priority is to get rid of Hamas, but clearly there will be the aftermath of that and what happens. Do you think Israel should be just making it a bit clearer to the international community about what they plan to do?
I certainly want to see a two-state solution. I want to see somehow or other that has got to be achieved. But after this, what I don't think is reasonable to expect is that the Israelis can have on their doorstep an armed state with monopoly of the legitimate use of violence run by Hamas. Absolutely not. There is just no way that is going to happen. And that's off the agenda. So there will have to be some other solution, and there are many different permutations, but that's where it will end up. But for the time being, we've got to focus on, I think the Israelis have got to focus on taking the necessary steps to ensure this can never happen again.
And we will have more on that interview with Boris Johnson throughout the morning for you. And worth noting that the former Prime Minister will be joining the presenter lineup here on GP News in the new year.